I set up this show, and then I did something very stupid, which is not recommended to anybody. Now, before you judge me for what I say next, before you judge me for this next statement, you have to understand that it is not meant in the way that it's going to sound at first. And you have to follow for my subsequent explanation where I qualify to undo what I've done. My biggest mistake after setting up this show was clicking on Good Logic show. My good friend Joe Neerman, I clicked on his show out of an abundance of curiosity. And it was one of the worst decisions I've made in a while. Now, some people think that's a slam at Good Logic. It is not. Great. A very good friend, a great broadcaster, a wonderful streamer. But he had on his show today motherfucking Pisco. And I don't know, like every time I see his name, my brain literally inserts motherfucking in front of his name. It's always motherfucking Pisco. Every fucking time. He has Pisco on the damn show. I think Pisco is now a lawyer, a licensed attorney. I think so. But I don't actually know. Last time I talked to him, he was a third-year law student, or he just graduated. I don't know. But when I talked to him, it was about the abortion question, Roe versus Wade, really. It was the question of Roe versus Wade and should there be some protection for the unborn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was on Destiny's show, and it ended up being me versus 3 lawyers effectively on the abortion question. And obviously, I won that debate. It wasn't even hard. But that being said, Pisco was on today talking about the disqualification of Trump with Joe. And I just don't know how to describe that without slurs. Like, I don't know how to describe it without immense amounts of profanity and uncouth language. Because all I wanted to do the entire time was scream. It was mind-numbing. It's so fucking bad. But the amount of insane assertions that this guy made in the short period of time that I'm watching, and then he accuses other people of just asserting conclusions. But his claims are nuts. He claims that Article 3 of Section or of the 14th Amendment, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, is self-executing. It ignores that Section 5 of the 14th Amendment specifically empowers the federal Congress to make laws to enforce the provisions of the entire amendment. And he says, no, it's self-executing. And no, Article 3, or Section 3, I always say Article, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not have an enforcement provision in it. In fact, it has a restorative provision by which Congress can reinsert someone as a eligible candidate. Let's ignore the fact that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, has no application to a president by its express text, not by the naming of positions that are disqualified for office, and similarly and subsequently, not by the express text of the oath to support the Constitution. The President of the United States does not take an oath to support the Constitution. Every other office listed does. Every other office listed in Section 3 takes an oath to support the Constitution. The president does not. So, we have 2 express omissions of the president, first by name and second by oath. Yet Pisco asserts out of nowhere that it is a self-executing clause to disqualify a president who participates in an insurrection. But the problem is participation in an insurrection is not self-evident when an insurrection isn't self-evident. And January 6th, by no prior definition of insurrection, qualifies as an insurrection. And in fact, likely qualifies expressly as protected First Amendment activity in the general nature of it, with specific crimes committed during protected First Amendment activity that go outside the scope of protected activity, just like every other fucking protest on the planet. If you are properly executing and exercising your First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, to speak, and to petition your government for redress of grievance, then there is no wrong action. Now, if you exceed that and are no longer peaceably assembled, then individually, following due process, you may have a conviction that overshadows your rights. Only by a jury of your peers in criminal court. An insurrection is a criminal offense under the law. Not only has Trump not been charged or convicted of an insurrection, he has not been charged with participating in any kind of insurrection. And the only thing that even comes close is a finding of fact and conclusion of law by a Colorado district court that states an insurrection occurred and Trump participated in it by clear and convincing evidence, which is not the evidentiary standard of any criminal conviction, is outside the jurisdiction of where the act took place, and further has a fucking federalist issue with the jurisdiction of a state court ruling on federal law from 1,500 miles away with no witnesses to the federal act. What the fuck are we even talking about? And Pisco suggests that this is a self-executing clause. Well, if it was a self-executing clause, there wouldn't need to be a finding of fact and conclusion of law that Trump participated in insurrection, except to the manner that the state would be recognizing, specifically a federal conviction from the DC circuit on fucking point. But they don't have that. Instead, they have a finding of fact and conclusion of law based on bullshit. And Pisco is always all too happy to shovel bullshit into his goddamn fat, stupid mouth and then spout off about how correct he is. Oh my goodness. Look at the amount of federal rights this motherfucker shreds in the rabid pursuit of making Trump an insurrectionist to justify his removal from the ballot in Colorado and Maine. It's the stupidest shit I could ever imagine any attorney expressing a constitutional background to have. But hey, motherfucking Pisco. Motherfucking Pisco. So, whew. It's amazing. It's amazing. And it's not unique to Pisco, right? Like a bunch of people are all too happy to just shred all pretense of due process, shred all pretense of your 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights. Well, Trump's 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights because he's an asshole or whatever, I guess. I guess that's what it means. Like, wow, he's an asshole, so I guess he doesn't get this. And Joe is actually raising very, very good arguments. Now, not in the way that I would, right? Because I would have just screamed a long time ago. Because Pisco is maddeningly inaccurate in how he interprets the Constitution and then states it as a truth. And he's like, well, yours is a conclusion, so I think the burden's on you. It's like, well, no. The burden is on you to show where Trump participated in an insurrection. First, you have to show an insurrection occurs. Then you have to show that he participated in it. Where's the insurrection? And I know it's stated over and over in the media for the dim-witted morons out there to sit and scoop up into their fucking Cheerios that Trump used criminal acts to subvert the peaceful transition of power. But anyone with a fucking newspaper archive can find that there was no interruption to the peaceful transition of power, which would happen again. What is it? I can't do math. I'm not Asian. 15 days after January 6th, without a hitch, in which Trump participated in the inauguration in his constitutional role. I fucking saw an article that specifically suggested that Trump did not participate in the inauguration. It's like, motherfucker, he was right there and executed his constitutional role of ceremonially handing power over to Joe Biden. There's a real question on if a president can refuse to hand over power in any meaningful and legal way, maybe, or if it is, again, a ceremonial role of the president to participate. Like, if the president isn't there, is the next president inaugurated? Probably, yeah. But even so, he was there and handed it over, and he did not object to the peaceful transition of power. It never stopped. It never hiccuped for a moment. All pending questions, legally and constitutionally, were resolved prior to January 21st and the inauguration. And anyone who says otherwise should have a fucking skewer through their goddamn brain, because they're so retarded and so hell-bent on this position that they just won't look at explicit fact. It's explicit fact. It is. Man, looks like I picked the wrong day to stop drinking. What the It's stated ad nauseum in every media publication. Obviously, the entire purpose of this is to brainwash and propagandize the populace into the conclusion that Trump somehow interfered with the inauguration. It's amazing. It's amazing. How do you combat just rampant willful idiocy? There is no interference in the transition of power. Trump's ability to interfere in the transition of power is questionable at best. Any president, absent an execution of military authority to delay the inauguration. Someone who can delay the inauguration and has delayed the inauguration, if I'm not mistaken, is the vice president. The vice president, in reading the electoral votes and certifying them, which they tried to say under Pence was clearly a ceremonial role, but has not traditionally been ceremonial. Maybe it is now. Who knows? Maybe we have to answer that question. In the past, if the vice president does not certify the electoral results of a state and returns them to the state for investigation, recount, whatever it is, that can delay an inauguration, has. But that is the vice president's role. And it is informed by objections from members of Congress in the constitutional process by which all of this occurs, by which was being executed on January 6th until the insurrection actually stopped the process and then caused members of Congress who were going to object to states that had not been read yet to change their mind and to not object. If anything, the transition of power was preserved by the acts on January 6th, albeit unwittingly. But in any case, they had no prospective ability to continue to interfere in so much as they interfered through January 21st. And I would challenge anyone to suggest how a group of unarmed citizens who walk peacefully in some cases and then push violently in other cases, without guns, without supplies, was going to take over the halls of Congress and hold it down and prevent an inauguration 15 days later. How is this going to happen? By what practical mechanism does the National Guard not just go in and just go, brep? The only reason that the January 6 people were not literally mowed down in a hail of gunfire in the halls of Congress, there's a couple. One, really shit PR. Really shit PR if you put down a political protest, even one that was as violent as the January 6th one. And that's giving all deference to all reports of violence. But even one as violent as January 6th, mowing people down in the halls of Congress, not a good look for just about anybody involved. Possibly sparking something like a civil war, or at least severe civil unrest. By the way, what's up to Good Logic and his Raiders? We're just talking about Pisco. We're just now talking about Pisco. But had they mowed down the January 6th interlopers in the halls of Congress, bad PR. The other reason they didn't is because, questionably, until the narrative fits, very strong exercise of First Amendment rights. And then furthermore, there wasn't a sufficiently violent push to warrant that level of violent response. There just wasn't. In fact, the response to one person, Ashley Babbitt, being shot in the halls of Congress was so inflammatory and so questionable that the idea of mowing down an entire crowd would have been unfathomable. It would have looked like the tyranny that it was. And looking like tyranny is the one thing they always want to avoid while they're enacting tyranny. But had the January 6th protesters walked into the halls of Congress carrying long rifles, shotguns, and other firearms, shooting at Capitol Police, or even threatening and brandishing at Capitol Police, what would have happened? We might have seen them mowed down in the halls of Congress, and people wouldn't have objected. If they had lit the White House, if they lit the Capitol building on fire, what would have happened? If they had gotten a hold of a senator or a congressman and actually put them in danger, or grabbed Mike Pence, what would have happened? Gunfire, blood in the hallways. National incident. But there's a reason none of that happened. It's because none of that fucking happened. Because it doesn't look like an insurrection, because it wasn't an insurrection. It was a group of people disagreeing with an election and the results, whether they are correct or incorrect. Their right to voice that disagreement is unquestionable. Now, what is questionable is how many laws were actually violated by individuals. Because remember, collectively, we cannot violate law. You cannot violate law as a collective. You must be tried individually with the right to defend yourself based on your actions. Now, are there ways to aggregate actors into an act? Well, yes, we have people who are accessories. We have people who engage in conspiracy. Of course, there are specific conditions of criminal law that allow people to be grouped together, but the defense of those positions is individual. And there are situations where two co-conspirators can be found simultaneously guilty and not guilty of a conspiracy, which is pretty interesting. But it has to do with what level of proof the government has. So with all of that, you cannot collectively assign an act to a group of people. They must be individually processed and prosecuted with sufficient individual probable cause to raise charges and sufficient legal basis for each of those charges backed up by evidence. And I pity anyone who has to live under the country that says otherwise. So, did Donald Trump engage in an insurrection? Maybe. How do we find out? If only there was some mechanism by which a person can be tested, maybe by like a group of 12 people, with some facts and argument presented as to how they fall under this criminal schema. If there were only some system that we had that could do this, if only someone had thought of it. I guess we'll just have to sit and wonder of what would have happened if there were some system by which criminality could be determined that was in the Constitution, but there just isn't. There just isn't one. It's insane. It's insane. And the amount of people who fully buy into this idea. Oh, yeah, of course he did. Of course he engaged in an insurrection. Like, wait, what? Do you even know what that is? Do you even know what that means? And then let's ignore all, again, that's ignoring the underlying textual problems with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Just as a recap, which does not include the President of the United States, expressly does not include the President of the United States in the list of people who are not eligible, and also by including a different oath than the President says. But I digress. And yet you have someone out there purporting to be a lawyer, just making the constitutional argument that the 14th Amendment is completely self-executing. There is actually an argument that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, I'm going to say but was fully self-executing. The argument that supports the 14th Amendment, Section 3 being fully self-executing, necessitates that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, was a one-time provision that could not be applied in the future. The argument would be that it was so self-evident that the insurrection being referred to is the Civil War, in which all of the participation in the Civil War is expressly identifiable. And the list of officers, representatives, senators, and delegates to the president and the vice president that is listed there is so obviously conclusory because everybody who did that is known. It is known, right? Like Khal Drogo. So you could say that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is self-executing, but only insofar as to the existing, obviously self-referential insurrection that had just occurred and ended a few years prior, and that the amendment was directly referencing. But to suggest that any quote unquote insurrection in the future would be similarly self-executing is folly, because what even is an insurrection? An insurrection is not an act of war that is found by Congress. And we have a problem, right? Because there is actually reference to an insurrection in the Constitution. Does anybody remember what that is? Oh, yeah. Yeah, the commander-in-chief, I believe, can call upon the militia to suppress an insurrection. Did the commander-in-chief call upon the militia to suppress an insurrection? Ooh. And doesn't that fundamentally suggest that the commander-in-chief cannot participate in an insurrection? Because if the commander-in-chief is required to suppress the insurrection and no one else can order a National Guard or a national militia, I guess the national militia at the time, to suppress an insurrection, then it seems to indicate that a commander-in-chief cannot logically participate in an insurrection, because how does one insurrect themselves? Now, I know what people are thinking. They're like, well, what about, I can hear it. What about, yeah, what about it? Oh, it's like we have a couple different provisions to remove a sitting president from office. It's almost like a president cannot insurrect against his own administration, but in case that he manifested an act of insurrection, he would be impeached and removed as president, and then would no longer be recognized as having the power he would no longer be recognized as having the inability to insurrect his own administration, because by his actions that were impeachable, he had no longer maintained control of the administration. Now, practically, of course, an impeachment takes time, and the impeachment result would occur sometime after the insurrection events. But that does not mean that the power of the president would actually follow to the time of the execution or the conviction under impeachment. The acts themselves would be sufficient to remove the authority. And then, according to the Constitution, a president could be prosecuted. So it's almost like if Donald Trump had been impeached for an insurrection, like if that had happened, and then at his impeachment trial, he lost and was removed from office for the insurrection, he would be found to have participated in an insurrection. Because that actually does exist. That mechanism does exist. And they tried it and they fucking failed. Now, why did they fail? Oh, yeah, because they just could not show that it was an insurrection. They can't. And I know they're like, well, but it's only because the Republicans wouldn't do it. Yeah, because the Republicans didn't agree to a sufficient number that it was an insurrection. Why not? Because Republicans didn't really trust that fucking vote either. But the amazing thing about this is all of this is actually laid out in the Constitution. And there isn't any reason, there is no reason to try and go to outside arguments, to go into these abstract ideas, because all of it is expressly within the text. And it does not support the idea that Donald Trump could have participated in insurrection in any way, absent an impeachment on the issue. He was impeached on the issue. They did not find him guilty. Therefore, he cannot have participated in an insurrection. He just can't. I would love to see someone confront that argument and come up with some way, sensically, that he can. But I don't know. That's just like my opinion, man. It's just like my opinion. But I saw Pisco on Joe's show. I sent 3 super chats to participate in my limited capacity in the discussion. And Pisco's responses to all of them were terrible. Bring Pisco on yourself? Oh, dude, I know. YouTube has an anti-bullying policy. Your boy HP Lovecraft. I'd probably get banned forever.